everybody. It's Miss T. Thank you so much for joining me again today. And as we are beginning, I want to go over my 4 reasons for doing this, which is to encourage, to inspire, to inform, and to empower. Hey. So, for today, what I kind of want to talk about is how to begin to have hard conversations with people when you have a different perspective or a different opinion to offer. I think this is very fitting for everything that's kind of going on in the world right now. And just in general, sometimes we have to have those hard conversations, and they're called hard conversations because they're not easy to have, right? So, I want to kind of give you a little bit of background on my history of having those hard conversations or being part of those hard conversations so that you can understand that I'm not just kind of saying this stuff, but I've kind of had to live through it a little bit. And again, this doesn't make my advice or anything any more valid than anybody else's. These are just tips. I am not saying you have to do this. I'm not saying it will always work. I'm just saying that I hope that this is some advice that you can take some time to process, think through, and decide for yourself if you want to use it, if it's helpful or not. Totally up to you. So, my background, I told you guys I had my bachelor's degree in global studies, and that dealt a lot with community development, nonprofit organizations, and grassroots organizations. However, that also dealt with having a lot of hard conversations. An example of that can be sitting at a fairly large table. As you can tell, I'm African American. At that table, there are also people that are Filipino, Hispanic, or Latino, people that are Caucasian, people that are Asian descent, people from all different cultures, and trying to have a conversation about race and lived experience, disproportionality that's going on in the world. And that's kind of what conversations are beginning to be around now. And it's not easy to start to have that conversation with people when you don't have kind of a language to use. Again, sometimes it's just kind of calling that elephant in the room out, but that's not one of the tips here. That's totally at your discretion, how you're feeling in that conversation, how the atmosphere is in that conversation, and you're deciding. But one of the first things I want to say is think about and make sure that you're paying attention to where you're coming from. So, are you coming from a place of love? And of course, we're like, yeah, that place of love. But it makes a huge difference if you're coming from that place of love. If you're coming from that place of love, that should impact your tone. It should impact all of this that you got going on there. That face expression. Your face should not look like this if you're coming from a place of love. Let's be honest, sometimes those feelings rise up and it's just like, can you just get it? But you want to try to make sure that you're coming from that place of love that again is impacting your tone, it's impacting your facial expression because it sets an atmosphere, it sets the tone for the conversation. Not only how you say, what you say matters, but also your words matter. Both of those are very important. So think about the words that you're putting together to form your sentence. Of course, we always think before we talk. Maybe. We think before we talk, but are we thinking about the words that we're putting together? Does that come across in a polite way? Does it come across in an aggressive way? Does it come across in a curious way? Think about that when you're having those conversations. And you also want to have a conversation where you're listening to hear what the other person is saying, even though you're sharing your perspective. After you've shared your perspective, or when a conversation is happening, or even before you've shared your perspective, make sure you're listening to truly hear that person and hear what they're saying. Don't listen trying to think of a comeback, like I've got to say this right after they say this, or they said this, so then that makes I have to say this right after. I think that's kind of a lot of what's going on social media. It's a lot of people trying to defend themselves, to speak out, and there's no problem with speaking out. However, the way that you're doing it, it matters. And I'm not saying one way is right, one way is wrong. I'm going to keep my personal opinion to myself about that. The last concept is to listen to understand what the other person is saying. When you're listening, sometimes we can think to ourselves, well, does that make sense to me? Well, the person that's talking to you isn't you. It might not make sense to you. And from sitting through these kind of conversations, having these conversations, what I've kind of deduced for myself is that I'm listening to what somebody else is saying. There's a difference if I listen to understand or I listen to agree. I think a lot of what's going on is people are only listening to agree. If they don't agree, they don't want to hear it. And that shuts down the conversation. And if no conversation happens, then there's no change. There's no mutual understanding of one another. We're losing that. So I want to encourage you to listen to just understand what they're saying. And understanding what they're saying doesn't mean that it has to make sense to you, but it just means that you can make sense of what they're saying. You can say, okay, they got A plus B and they got C in the end. It's not, hey, you got from A to D. Wait, what just happened? Because you're still kind of lost, still kind of confused. You want to make sure that you're listening to just understand, not necessarily to agree. Whether or not you agree, well, if you're having this hard discussion, that's probably because you don't agree, and that's okay. But if a conversation is able to take place, then you can take steps to move towards a place where, whether or not you guys agree, there's a mutual understanding, or maybe even moving towards a place where, in the end, you guys do agree. So, again, coming from that place of love, most important thing, your tone, what you say, how you say it. You also want to make sure that you're listening to understand, not necessarily to agree. And lastly, you want to make sure that you are listening to hear what the other person is saying, not just listening to think about what you're going to say back or just to get your point across. Because if it's one-sided, it's not a conversation. So I hope that this has been helpful. Again, this is not a one-size-fits-all. This is not an answer to every single conversation, but I hope that this is at least some useful information. I learned this through my program and having those challenging conversations where you're sitting in your seat kind of just like squirming around because it's super uncomfortable. But hey, sometimes those conversations just gotta be had because a different opinion exists and it's worth being heard. Again, Jesus is the reason for everything that I do. He is good. I believe in God, but you don't have to be a Christian to listen to this channel. And I hope that you have a wonderfully blessed day because I'm still going to tell that to you anyways. See you next time.